A Wednesday evening in early March 1966, a pub in Whitechapel, East London, ordinary night. A man perched at the bar with a glass of beer, unbothered, relaxed. Then the front door swings open. The man glances up, recognizes who just walked in. Instead of going pale, he grins, tosses out a casual 5-word remark, something along the lines of, "Oh, didn't expect to see you." No reply comes. The visitor crosses the room, draws a pistol, fires once, point blank, into the man's forehead. A record skips on the jukebox. The man crumples off his bar stool and hits the floor. The shooter walks straight back out the door. There were at least a dozen people in that pub. For 3 full years, not one of them admitted to seeing anything. That was what real power looked like in 1960s East London. Welcome back. Today, we're cutting through one of the most heavily romanticized stories in British criminal history, the Kray twins. You've seen the 2015 film Legend. You've seen Tom Hardy in a double role, sharp suits, jazz lighting, and a story that somehow made 2 of the most dangerous men in modern British history look like complicated anti-heroes. What we're doing today is pulling back that curtain, because the documented truth, the court records, the witness testimonies, the psychiatric evaluations, tells a story that no Hollywood production would dare put on screen exactly as it happened. Let's go from the beginning. Ronnie and Reggie Kray entered the world on October 24, 1933, in a cramped terraced house in Hoxton, East London. Reggie arrived first. Ronnie followed about 10 minutes later, smaller, frailer, already fighting just to breathe. Their mother Violet was devoted to both boys, but she hovered especially close to Ronnie, who nearly died at age 3 from a severe bout of diphtheria. Doctors had quietly advised the family to prepare for the worst. He pulled through. But people who knew the family would later suggest that something shifted in Ronnie after that illness, something that never quite settled back into place. Their father, Charlie, was a small-time trader who spent much of the Second World War dodging military conscription. He drank heavily and vanished for stretches at a time. Violet raised the twins largely on her own, and she did so with an unshakable message. You two are different. You are meant for something bigger. By the time the boys were 10, they were already brawling in the streets. By 16, they faced assault charges after hospitalizing another teenager outside a dance hall. The charges evaporated. The witnesses couldn't seem to remember what they'd seen. It was the first rehearsal for a pattern that would repeat for the next 20 years. In 1952, the twins were called up for national service. Their military career lasted approximately 24 hours. On their first morning, they punched a corporal in the face and walked off the base. What followed was a revolving door of military detention facilities, brawls, insubordination, and flat refusals to follow any order from anyone. They were dishonorably discharged in 1954, having learned one thing clearly. They had no interest in answering to anybody, so they didn't. With £100 between them, they purchased a rundown snooker hall on Mile End's Eric Street and called it the Regal. It was a cramped, dim room above a row of shops. It became the foundation of an empire. Films tend to skip past the mechanics of how protection money is actually extracted. So let's be specific. A Kray enforcer, sometimes the twins themselves, would walk into a local business, a pub, a cafe, a market stall. They'd sit down, order something, and then very calmly, they'd say something like, "This is a nice little place. Shame if it ran into any trouble." The business owner had 2 options. Pay up, around £50 a week in 1955, which represented roughly half the average British worker's weekly wage, or decline, and watch what happened next. smashed windows, burned stock, customers beaten in the car park, until word spread and nobody came back. Within 18 months of opening the Regal, the Krays were collecting from more than 30 businesses across Bethnal Green and Whitechapel. By 1960, that number had climbed past 100. The weekly take was somewhere around £2,000, the equivalent of roughly £50,000 in today's money, and the police hadn't managed to pin a single serious charge on either brother. Here's the part that made them genuinely difficult to bring down. They didn't only terrorize the East End, they also performed generosity, strategically, theatrically, but consistently. They paid for funerals when elderly neighbors couldn't afford one. They handed cash to struggling families. They bought rounds for the whole pub. They showed up at children's birthday parties and shook hands and smiled for photographs. The same man who had broken someone's legs on a Tuesday would be buying that man's mother a drink by Friday. EastEnders loved them because they were local boys who had climbed out of poverty. EastEnders feared them because they killed people without hesitation. And in the working-class culture of 1950s London, that particular combination of love and terror elevated them to something approaching mythological status. By the early 1960s, they had moved upmarket. They acquired a West End club called Esmeralda's Barn in Knightsbridge. Suddenly, these two kids from Bethnal Green were socializing with conservative lords, aristocrats, and celebrities. Actress Barbara Windsor became a regular. Judy Garland visited. A conservative peer named Lord Boothby was photographed with them repeatedly. In 1965, the photographer David Bailey shot what would become their most iconic portrait. Two men in dark suits, hair slicked back, expressions completely empty. That image would end up hanging in pubs across the East End for the next 60 years. It's the image the film sold back to us. Before we pull the film apart, let's be fair about what it captured accurately. The dynamic between the brothers, the suffocating dependency, the way Reggie could never fully break free, no matter how much he might have wanted to, that rings true. The period detail is largely authentic. The clothes, the cars, the music, the social world they inhabited. Tom Hardy's physical differentiation between the two brothers is genuinely remarkable filmmaking. The film also correctly establishes that Ronnie was openly gay at a time when homosexuality was still criminalized in Britain, a real and documented fact. It shows him as paranoid, volatile, and mentally unwell. That's all accurate. Ronnie was sectioned in 1958 and formally diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He was prescribed antipsychotic medication for the remainder of his life. When he took it, he was slow and withdrawn. When he stopped taking it, he became unpredictable and extremely dangerous. Now here's where the documented record diverges sharply from the film. The movie presents the violence as stylized, almost choreographed, with a kind of dark elegance to it. Real Kray violence was nothing like that. In 1964, a man named Lenny Hamilton made the mistake of insulting Ronnie at a club. Ronnie's response was to use a heated iron rod to brand Hamilton's face. Hamilton lost the sight in one eye. He stayed silent about what had happened for 3 decades, not because he'd forgiven anyone, but because he knew exactly what speaking out would cost him. There's also a documented account of Ronnie stabbing a fellow gang member in the abdomen with a bayonet at a Christmas gathering, because the man laughed at the wrong moment. The film also treats Reggie's marriage with a degree of tragic romanticism. Some of that is warranted. By all accounts, Reggie did genuinely love Frances Shay. They married in April 1965, with Bailey photographing the event. But what the film barely addresses is what that marriage actually looked like from the inside. Francis was 22 years old and already emotionally fragile. Reggie's controlling behavior, his violent temper, his extended disappearances, and his refusal to allow her any independence wore her down completely. She eventually returned to her parents' home in an attempt to escape. On June 7, 1967, Frances Shay was found dead from a barbiturate overdose. She was 23 years old. The official finding was suicide. Her family has never fully accepted that verdict. What is not in dispute is that Reggie was shattered, and that within 4 months of her death, he would carry out the most brutal act of his criminal career. To understand the blind beggar shooting, you need to understand the landscape of London organized crime in 1966. The Krays were not operating unopposed. South London was controlled by the Richardson gang, who ran their operations with a sadism that impressed even hardened criminals. Their interrogation method of choice involved strapping men to chairs in scrap yards and applying electric current, bolt cutters, or whatever else happened to be nearby. George Cornell was a Richardson associate. He was physically large, loud, and crucially, not particularly intelligent about who he insulted. At a West End club in December 1965, Cornell had referred to Ronnie Kray, in front of multiple witnesses, as a fat poof. For most people, an insult is an insult. For a man already hearing voices, already convinced that everyone around him was conspiring against him, already operating without the full restraint that medication provides, it was a death sentence delivered by the recipient himself. When word reached Ronnie on the evening of March 9th, 1966, that Cornell was alone at a pub less than a mile away, the decision was made in minutes. He collected his driver and a companion, put the pistol in his coat, and walked in. The rest took seconds. Afterward, he went home, changed his shirt, had a cup of tea. Scotland Yard knew immediately who had pulled the trigger. They could not prove it. The barmaid on duty that night knew exactly what she had witnessed. She said nothing. Not to police, not to her husband, not to anyone. The two men who had been drinking alongside Cornell watched a murder happen directly in front of them and told investigators they hadn't been paying attention. Every other witness in that pub developed a sudden and convenient inability to recall the evening. Detective Superintendent Leonard Nipper Reed had been attempting to build a case against the Krays since 1964. He failed in 1965. He failed in 1966. He failed in 1967. Every time a witness agreed to testify, they subsequently withdrew, sometimes due to direct intimidation, sometimes after unexplained incidents that discouraged further cooperation. Red later described this period as the most professionally maddening of his entire career. He had documented evidence pointing clearly at two men for multiple murders. He couldn't find a single person willing to say so out loud in a courtroom. The Kray network hadn't just intimidated the East End, it had absorbed it. Jack McVitie earned his nickname by wearing a hat at all times to conceal his bald patch. He was 35, drank too much, and worked as a low-level enforcer for the firm. In summer 1967, Ronnie had paid him £500 to murder a former Kray associate named Leslie Payne. McVitie took the money. He never attempted the job. Then, in what can only be described as spectacular misjudgment, he began boasting openly in pubs that the Krays were finished, that Ronnie was a psychiatric case who couldn't manage his own medication, that the whole operation was falling apart. Word circulated. Ronnie wanted him dead. Reggie agreed. On the night of October 29, 1967, McVitie was lured to a basement flat in Stoke Newington with the promise of a party. He walked in to find the music playing and a room full of people, and Reggie Kray standing in the center, pointing a gun at him. Reggie pulled the trigger. The gun misfired. McVitie scrambled for the door. Ronnie grabbed him. Reggie seized a kitchen knife. What followed was witnessed by at least 8 people. McVitie did not die quickly. He bled out on the basement floor while everyone in that room stood frozen, understanding that what they had just seen bound them to silence permanently. The body was wrapped in bedding and removed by the twins' older brother Charlie, who would later claim he hadn't known what he was transporting. McVitie's remains have never been recovered. Theories range from the English Channel to industrial incineration, but the damage was done. Because unlike Cornell's killing, fast and controlled, this murder had too many witnesses, too much chaos, too much blood, and too many people who would eventually calculate that their own survival depended on talking. Nipper Red got his opening in early 1968. Leslie Payne, the man McVitie had been paid to kill and had declined to, agreed to talk. Then others followed. Then the dam broke entirely. On May 8, 1968, coordinated dawn raids across East London brought in Ronnie, Reggie, Charlie Kray, and 15 members of the wider firm. The trial opened at the Old Bailey on January 7, 1969. It ran for 39 days, at that point, the longest murder trial in English legal history. On March 4, 1969, both twins were convicted. Ronnie received life imprisonment with a minimum 30-year term for the murder of George Cornell. Reggie received the same for the murder of Jack McVitie. The sentencing judge told them plainly that society had earned the right to be protected from them. Ronnie was formally certified criminally insane in 1979 and transferred to Broadmoor High-Security Psychiatric Hospital, where he spent the rest of his life. He held meetings, gave interviews, and married twice from inside the institution, maintaining a strange performance of relevance while increasingly detached from reality. He died of a heart attack on March 17, 1995, aged 61. Reggie served 29 years across various British prisons. He converted to Christianity, wrote books, and married a woman named Roberta Jones while still incarcerated. In August 2000, he was released on compassionate grounds after being diagnosed with inoperable bladder cancer. He died 5 weeks later, on October 1, 2000. He was 66. Neither man died as a legend. They died as old, broken prisoners. The clubs closed the day the arrests were made. The businesses they had bled for years quietly went back to functioning. The witnesses, who had been silent for a decade, finally testified and survived. East London moved on. Here's what legend the film ultimately sold you: the idea that there is something compelling, even admirable, about men who are dangerous enough and stylish enough to operate above the law. The suits, the nightclubs, the celebrity connections, the myth of two brothers who were simply too sharp, too powerful, too alive to be contained. What the actual record shows is considerably less cinematic. Two boys raised in poverty, marked by trauma, failed by every institution that should have helped them, who decided the only route to significance was making everyone around them too frightened to object. For about 15 years, it worked. Then it didn't. Their total criminal earnings over their entire operation wouldn't match what a mid-level drug distributor turns over today. Their territory was smaller than most mid-sized cities. The people who claimed to admire them largely did so because the alternative, admitting they were terrified, felt worse. The glamour was always a performance. The suits were costumes. The photographs were propaganda. Behind the image was a man who heard voices and tortured people, and a man who destroyed the woman he claimed to love, and then killed someone with a kitchen knife. That's the real Kray story, not a legend, a warning. If this breakdown gave you something the film didn't, subscribe. We release a new deep dive every week. Drop a comment below and tell us which other crime films you think have the biggest gap between Hollywood myth and documented reality. We'll cover the ones you ask for most.